Welcome to today's webinar, Controlling Landscape Bedweeds in the Fall, brought to you by Landscape Management and by our sponsor, SureGuard Herbicide. I'm Allison Barwatz from North Coast Media, digital editor for Landscape Management magazine, and I will be your event manager. Before we get started, I want to let you know that today's webinar will be recorded. You are currently in a listen-only mode. The recording will be available 1 day from today on our website, landscapemanagement.net/webinar. A link to the on-demand recording will also be mailed to you when it is available. At this time, I'd like to acquaint you with the ways in which you can participate during today's presentation. Please notice that in the lower left-hand corner of your console, there is a Submit button. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation. Just type in the text box at the bottom left, then click Submit to place your question in the line. Questions that were submitted during registration may be covered in this webinar. Some questions may also be answered in an upcoming issue of Landscape Management magazine or in one of our weekly e-newsletters, LM Direct. We strive to answer as many of your questions as possible. Finally, if you experience any technical difficulties during today's event, select Help to submit your issue, and Assistant Producer Joelle Harms or I will personally assist you. Now, I'd like to turn today's event over to our moderator, Landscape Management Editor Marisa Palmieri.
Thank you, Allison, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. Our topic today is controlling landscape bedweeds in the fall in particular, and we have a great presenter lined up for today. Also, we have to thank our sponsor, SureGuard Herbicide, for making today's webinar possible. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jason Fossey, Ph.D., who's a weed scientist with New Farm Americas. Jason's here to give a welcome and introduce today's presenter.
Good afternoon and welcome. As Marissa mentioned, my name is Jason Fossey, and I'm a research and development specialist with New Farm. It's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Andy Senesac. Andy is someone that I've worked with my entire career, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from today. Dr. Senesac has worked with Cornell at the Long Island Horticultural Research and Extension Center since 1985. His major areas of research centers around developing weed control programs for landscapes, ornamental production, and turf grass. Andy also works in agriculture crop and more recently has become heavily involved in the educational needs of dealing with invasive weeds. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Andy Senesac.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you for this opportunity, Jason and Marissa. Hopefully we'll have a fun session today. And although I don't know if anyone has fun when they're thinking about weeds. Managing weeds in landscapes in the fall has a slightly different set of problems than in the spring. And often in the fall we have opportunity to clean up weedy situations which really aren't possible in the spring. And sometimes we can even make our life easier in the spring by taking actions in the fall. The first step is to determine the overall goal for the individual property that we're managing. Does the budget allow for extra care in the fall? And for purposes of this discussion, we're going to assume that a high level of maintenance in the landscape bed is required. So this would include. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to be sure I'm on the right slide here. This would include weed scouting, and if needed, weeds can be removed in the fall with selective herbicides, non-selective herbicides, and of course hand pulling and physical removal of the weeds otherwise. I'm also going to discuss some thoughts about weed mulch replenishment, and what factors are involved in and causing mulches to degrade to the point where they need to be replenished, and also weed movement to and from nearby turf and nurseries as well. So let's talk about scouting for weeds, some of the things to consider. At the end of the summer is a time when many weed seedlings are appearing, which is kind of counterintuitive, but actually it's the winter annual and biennial weeds that are germinating at this time of year. Also, some perennials germinate as well. Most of the summer annuals are completing their life cycle, all of them really, and many of them are in the process of shedding seed. And so this can, in some cases, preventing the seed from getting all over the landscape bed will help for next year's weed profile. Also, certain perennial weeds are much better controlled with actions in the fall than in the spring or the summer. And there are some escaped ornamentals that are causing some real problems with being garden thugs, as they call them. In this slide, we're looking at two weeds in the aster family or sunflower family. The seeds of this family often have an adaptation called a pappus, which allows the seeds to move around and move away from the mother plant on air currents and in the wind. And this is, as we all know, this is how dandelion seed is spread. And in this case, on the left, we're looking at common groundsel, and on the right, horseweed, or sometimes called mare's tail. Many winter annual seeds are germinating at this time of year, and they often look very differently in the fall than what you'll be looking at in the springtime. And so I wanted to, I have some photographs of some of the weeds that we have listed here, but some of those common ones are bittercress, oxalis, often called wood sorrel, horseweed, speedwell, chickweed, garlic mustard, henbit, and purple dead nettle. Most of them are of the weeds that we see are broadleaf weeds, but there are a few grasses that we see in the fall germinating, and the major one would be annual bluegrass and, in some cases, downy brome. Here we're looking at an array of pictures of these annual weeds that many of the pictures show the weeds in the springtime, which is when they're most recognizable. The purple dead nettle is a weed that when I first started working here on Long Island, it was a fairly rare weed, and now it's one of our most common winter annual weeds. So the weed spectrum does change over time for various reasons and climate concerns as well, or constrictions. Garlic mustard is another winter annual or biennial that we have seen a lot more in landscapes and the edges of landscapes than we used to ever see before for the last 10 years. Okay. Germinating perennials that have recently shed seed are also something to consider when we're doing a weed inventory or scouting for weeds. And some of the ones to look for that we see a lot of is seedlings of pokeweed, poison ivy, oriental bittersweet, and woody tree seedlings. The birds will consume these seeds and move them around in the landscape. Here's an example of poison ivy seedling and pokeweed seedlings. So we have in the fall we have seedlings of these weeds as well as mature plants to deal with. So there are certain perennial weeds that, as they're maturing in the fall, are more susceptible to being controlled than earlier in the season, and particularly in the spring. The main reason is that they're moving the carbohydrates or food down into their underground storage organs at this time of year. Most will be completely dead with the killing frost. The above ground portion will die, and so they survive the winter through these rhizomes or roots or tubers. And the herbicides, when they're applied systemically, move with the carbohydrates and allow for greater control of those rhizomes at this time of year. And in addition, we have the hostility of the winter to help that process along. And here we have some pictures of Canada thistle, a pokeweed, and mugwort. The pictures of mugwort show shows the cycle of how mugwort spreads from the nursery on plant material into the landscape bed where the plants are planted either through the rhizomes or oftentimes through the wind-blown seed. Some of the other perennial weeds to be aware of that might be able to be controlled better at this time of year is quackgrass. Particularly, it's a weed that is susceptible to control in the springtime and in the fall, but not in the summer, because it goes through a period in the summer when it's not really actively growing. And then as the cool nights start in the late summer, the quackgrass starts to grow again. And it's at this time that a selective post-emergent herbicide could be applied, and a certain level of control could be attained. The other two weeds in the slide are yellow nutsedge and kailinga. You may or may not be familiar with kailinga, which is a fairly new weed for us in the Northeast. It is a sedge closely related to nutsedge, but doesn't produce nutlets or tubers. And both of these weeds will survive the winter either through the tubers or, in the case of kailinga, in underground rhizomes. Some of the weed problems that we have are of our own making. Certain ornamentals have become, they produce large seed or a copious amount of seed, and those seeds can germinate during the growing season, during the late summer and fall. And so this is a time when they're fairly vulnerable to control, so these would also be ones to look for. Hibiscus, Rose of Sharon, and Budley are three that I've heard complaints about often. Actually, the grasses on this list are ones that are even more troublesome. That they've been planted widely, particularly the miscanthus and pennisetum. Here we have some pictures to go with those. For the grasses, the pennisetum is an ornamental grass where the seed is maturing fairly late in the summer, but certainly early enough for those seed to drop to the ground and some of the seedlings to become established in the fall. What we've seen with our experiments is that those seedlings, when they're very young and tender in the fall, they can be fairly well controlled with post-emergent selective herbicides like Acclaim. However, if they go through the winter and they get toughened and hardened off, and then the following spring they're much more difficult to deal with and control, either in the landscape or the nearby turf. And actually, pennisetum seems to be much more of a weed problem than miscanthus, which tends to produce seed later in the season and not so many seedlings in the fall. Running bamboo is really a topic for discussion for another session, but it's certainly a weed that you want to be aware of if it's on the perimeter of a property or a landscape that you're managing, because that is a weed that will, if you see it, you'll probably be seeing it in your landscape at some point. So that's one to think about and determine that it needs to be dealt with at some point. As I said, the summer annuals that are germinating, if you can collect the seeds that are flying around, so much the better. But there are a couple of newly invasive weeds, relatively newly invasive weeds that we've seen that need to be dealt with slightly differently, and those would be either mile-a-minute weed or Japanese stiltgrass. Let's talk about the stiltgrass first. The picture here is actually showing three pictures. The seedlings have a very broad spatulate-like seedling or first true leaf, and they don't even really look like grasses. And then as the plant matures and grows, it has a very distinctive look. But because of the I think probably because of the art, where it came from, it doesn't produce flowers and seed until very late in the growing season. Usually August and September is when you first start to see flowering. So that actually is an opportunity to keep this weed from spreading, even with just mowing and collecting the seeds before they're mature, or and somehow removing those plants. Because they're an annual, once the seed is cut, the plant will die fairly quickly. The other weed, which we have seen a huge impact on both landscapes, and even more so on the edges of landscapes where woods and landscapes intersect, is a weed called mile-a-minute weed that came originally as a single plant from an abandoned nursery in southeastern Pennsylvania, and since then has spread to at least 12, probably more than many more than that actually at this point, states. It produces a fairly attractive large fruit, which is blue in the fall, and birds in their migrating will eat that fruit and then deposit the seed in their migratory path. But the thing about this weed that we noticed, and that is fairly well known actually, is that if you try to remove this weed physically at this time of year, what will happen is all of those, both mature and immature seedling fruit, will drop to the ground because they're very loosely held. And so it's really not worth making an effort to try to remove those plants, because it is an annual weed, and it will be completely dead with the hard frosts that come at the end of October and November. And it's much best to try to control this weed in the springtime, long before the flowers and seeds start to form, which is in late July. Okay, let's move on to. I think we've covered pretty well what the types of weeds that you'd be looking for in a landscape in the fall, and let's discuss now what the management options would be. So they basically break down into three categories: selective herbicide options, non-selective herbicides, and physical removal or prevention. The post-emergent herbicide application with selective herbicide options, there are a few, and they fall within categories of what they control. For broadleaf weeds, Lontrell or clopyralid is a very useful tool. It is particularly strong in controlling weeds in certain families. It's a growth-regulating herbicide, and it controls weeds in the aster or sunflower family, and also in the legume or clover family very well. It does not control weeds in the mustard or cress family at all well. So there's certain limitations and strengths for all of these materials, and that would be one of them for Lontrell. It really, for the most part, should be used as a spot treatment and a directed application. In some cases, with weeds like Canada thistle that grow up through woody landscapes like low-growing junipers, a directed application isn't possible. So, and it's important to look at that label and be sure that the application, if you are making one over the top, is among the list of ornamentals that tolerate that, because you can't cause significant injury to plants that aren't tolerant or aren't on the label. The next one is called Quicksilver. That is a trade name for carfentrazone. It's labeled for landscape areas where no ornamentals will be unintentionally exposed. This will only control broadleaf weeds, and it has a fairly limited use because of that, and also because it has to be made so that no drift can be moving into ornamentals, desirable ornamentals, because they will be injured. Basagran will control or suppress some broadleaf weeds as well as nutsedge, and it can be used over a few ornamentals and a few ground covers, but mostly it is used also as a directed application. Moving down that list to the grassy weeds, there are currently four materials available for controlling grasses selectively. And among these, the Acclaim Extra is primarily thought of as a turf herbicide that can also be used in landscape beds. And the reason is that it will not control perennial grasses, but only mostly crabgrass and certain annual grasses. The other three, Envoy, Fusillade, and Post, all are capable of selectively controlling weeds, both perennial grasses and annual grasses. And for instance, quackgrass is a weed that would be controlled particularly well by Fusillade and Envoy when an application were made this time of year. Now, the sedges are near the end of their lives, but if you still have good green foliage, then a late season application might prevent some of those underground portions from maturing. And so sedgehammer or basagran would be the options there. Okay, so moving on to the non-selective herbicide options, again, they break down into systemic and contact. The systemic materials would be either phenale or glufosinate or glyphosate. And the phenale has limited systemic activity, but it's very much more fast-acting than glyphosate. But it has a lot of the same types of properties that glyphosate has. Glyphosate is probably the most widely used landscape herbicide in the country, but it does have to be used judiciously because it is non-selective. And there are ways to make those applications so that they can be more useful in a landscape, such as shields or wipers. And even injections. There's an injection system that can be used in certain weeds like Japanese knotweed. Another option is to cut with specialized pruners that have an injection of glyphosate that happens as the pruners cut through the woody stems. And this allows the glyphosate to be sucked down into the lower portion of that cut weed, that cut poison ivy, for instance, and then kill. And by doing so, it will do a better job at controlling that weed. Much easier to make that application with that kind of technique than with spraying, in terms of not hurting nearby plants. Okay, so let's talk about the contact herbicides next. Reward is a trade name for diquat. It's a broad-spectrum contact material, works very well, and one of its weaknesses would be when it's applied to mature grasses, oftentimes the grasses will regenerate relatively quickly, this is a problem with all of the contact materials because grasses are protecting their growing tips with all the leaf sheaths, and it's very difficult to get to them with contact herbicides. Scythe is it's a herbicidal soap essentially, and it does have strong contact activity, probably not quite so strong as Reward. Barrier, there's a very specialized herbicide that can have some post-emergent activity that needs to be applied in cooler weather to avoid loss from vaporization, and also any nearby plant material that's herbaceous is very sensitive, so including turf grass. So most of these of the use of this barrier would be for hardscapes where that's not going to be an issue. There is a lot of interest actually in using reduced risk or organic products, two of which are on this list, Avenger and Adios. And the reason that they have had a lot of interest lately is that certain states have instituted laws which prohibit pesticide use in schoolyards unless it's an organic product. So these materials would be exempt from that law and allow some use. We've worked a little bit with them, and their control levels are vary widely, and some are. I don't think any of them attain the level of control that you'd get with Reward or even Scythe for that matter, but there is some level of control available. Okay, let's talk next about the third option, which is hand removal. Now, this would be there are certain times when hand removal is really the best option, or maybe the only option. If the client or property requires weed control that's organic or non-chemical, which is not the same thing, then hand removal really is the way to go there. Sometimes weeds are growing in and amongst the ornamentals, and it's just not possible to selectively control them other than by hand pulling. And sometimes if there's just a few weeds, it's easier and faster to just hand pull them rather than spray them or do some other kind of chemical control. If weeds are growing in a degraded mulch that's full of weed seeds, then sometimes just removing the mulch entirely along with the weeds and replenishing it is a better way to manage both the existing weeds and the ones for the following season. So that gets us to the point of mulch, considering mulch options. We've done some studies over the years and found pretty much the level of suppression that organic mulch is applied at 2 to 3 inch depth is around 50 to 70% of the annual weed seed that's in the soil. And this is the suppression of the weeds that are existing. Once the mulch is applied, it keeps the weeds from growing because it basically deprives them of the light that they need in order to get established. But most of the weed problems that we see in landscapes on mulches are weeds that they're either perennial weeds that penetrate the mulch, or they're weeds that have flown in on top of the mulch and germinate within the substrate. Weeds such as groundsel and dandelion have this capability. Oxalis and bittercress and a new weed called mulberry weed that we're seeing here up in the Northeast, they have self-propelled seed which moves from nearby landscapes or turf and then will be basically shooting into these mulched areas as well as unmulched areas. Birds, of course, and other wildlife move all kinds of weeds through their feces, and they're actively consuming crabgrass seed as they migrate, and they're moving that seed all over the place as well as other ones. So these are the problems that even mulched landscapes have to deal with in terms of how the weeds get there. What factors allow mulches to degrade? Well, when the mulch is applied in the springtime, usually that's the common time to apply it, it can either consist of composted materials, which are partially biodegraded, and usually these are made up of a variety of aggregate sizes, large, medium, even down into microscopic. Over the season, the smaller particles tend to disappear from the landscape, and they get moved by water or wind or just total degradation, so that the mulch thins over the season. And these smaller particles will stay wet longer and allow weed seeds that do blow in to germinate in that substrate. So if you're looking for a mulch that will not only control weeds that come up through, but also resist weeds that are blowing in, then larger, more uniform nugget sizes will tend to allow the weeds to fall down further into the profile and will therefore be deprived of the light that they need. However, the downside of that is that the larger aggregates generally need a thicker layer in order to get that to get the same level of control that you would with a organic mixed aggregate. So the question about replenishing in the fall, so what will this really accomplish? It will accomplish burying seeds and seedlings that are starting to germinate this time of year. The winter annuals will be suppressed if it's applied and replenished early in the fall or late in the summer. But by doing that, it also allows weeds to move in on top a greater period of time. And so for that reason, residual herbicides are commonly used at this time of year to prevent winter annual weeds from getting established. When should it be applied? Well, in late August, if you make the application in early September, late August, the residual control should be between 6 to 8 weeks for most materials. And that should get you through most of the fall fairly weed-free if the material is effective. Should it be applied on top of mulch as well as on bare ground? Well, if the mulch is replenished at that time of year, early in the September, late August, then an application would be lasting a fairly long time. But if the mulch is not replenished until later in this fall, say in late September, early October, I don't think it's nearly as necessary to make the residual herbicide application, because it won't really be enough time for many winter annuals to germinate before frost, at least up here on Long Island and New England. Now, if it has been decided that a pre-emergent herbicide is needed, there are several products to choose from. Excuse me, and this choice depends on several factors on which particular material is chosen. These are the things to consider would be weed control spectrum, longevity of control. In some cases, usually that's not too much of an issue in the fall. Formulations available, that's really a huge factor on whether they're sprays or granulars. The cost of the product, and also the cost of removing the weeds that aren't controlled. So I just want to go through some general pros and cons for the sprayable versus the granular formulations available. The pros would be that they're usually less expensive than the equivalent granules with the same active, and there's less volume of material needed to transport. There's usually better coverage as well when they're sprayed rather than the granule. And sometimes there is not an equivalent granular formulation available of that particular active ingredient that you're interested in. The cons are that there is more potential for ornamental plant injury, particularly with over-the-top applications. And in New York, the notification, or at least Long Island, the notification issues for sprays rather than granules are different. So the same pros and cons evaluation for granular formulations is that for the most part, the granules would be a little bit more safe, considered more safe to the ornamentals because they don't tend to, unless they actually lodge in the axils of the leaves, they don't tend to cause contact injury as nearly as much as the sprays do. Many of the products are combinations of two herbicides, and they allow for a broad spectrum of control. They often, the granules often fall where the weed seeds will also fall, so they're there and waiting for the weed seeds to start to germinate, and they'll be controlled that way. And also granules can be removed from dry foliage before irrigation or rain activates them, so that if there is a potential problem with the injury, shaking the plants and removing the granule can help that situation. Of course, the cons would be expense, transportation, and extra volume, and certainly the applications are very susceptible to uniformity of if there are windy conditions, or non-uniformity, I should say. Okay, so next slide I want to discuss what the sprayable formulations of herbicides are available for landscape use. It's quite a list, quite a long list, and I'm not going to go through all of them right here, but I did highlight or put asterisks by the materials that do not have equivalent granule formulations with that active ingredient, and those would be Devernol, Sedgehammer, and Spectacle, and I'll talk about Spectacle a little bit more. So some of the fall granular herbicides that are available for landscape use are also quite numerous. As you can see, many of them are consistent of two active ingredients, and this is primarily to control broadleaf and grassy weeds pre-emergently. And this is the second part of that list. So we have about a dozen or so options to choose from in the granule category. So how do we go about narrowing down the options? So let's just take a hypothetical case study where these were the conditions that are necessary. The material that's used has to be safe on most or near most herbaceous plantings. It will control grasses and broadleaves, or at least some grasses and some broadleaves. It can be applied so that nearby turf, if a overspray or overapplication is made to the nearby turf, injury will not be noticeable. So let's look at what some of the sprayable formulations, what those options are. Not safe. So the ones that are not safe near most herbaceous plantings. I'm sorry. I thought I had a. Okay, that slide I should have had a draw through on some of them. Spectacle is one of the newer materials that we have. The new active ingredient is called indaziflam. You may be familiar with it in other markets as Marengo, and it is available as a granular product under that name. Spectacle is only available as a spray right now, and the label does say that it shouldn't be made, application should not be made to mulch, but only to bare ground. So there are some restrictions which keep it from being used widely, particularly since it can be harmful to nearby herbaceous perennials and annuals. But the great pro about this herbicide is that it has a very long-lasting residual activity, up to twice as long as many of the other materials. So that is definitely a plus for this herbicide. Okay, so so making that choice, then let's look at the materials that will control grasses and broadleaf weeds potentially. So the ones that we would cross out would be Gallery, which only controls broadleaf weeds, Sedgehammer, which doesn't control grasses, and those would be the two there that would be eliminated. And then in terms of the application to nearby turf without injury, the ones that we would cross out would be Devernal, the sprayable form of Ronstar. Although Spectacle does have a reduced rate label for turf, cool season turf could be injured, and SureGuard would be the other that would also injure nearby turf. So looking at the, I just have to find my place here. One of these slides doesn't have some of the information that I thought it did. So looking at the granular formulations in terms of narrowing down, the granular materials that would not be safe near herbaceous plantings would be Barrier G, Broadstar. Those are the two that are specifically can't have problems with herbaceous plantings. Materials that will control some broadleaf and grass weeds. Everything on the list has some level of that activity, so you really wouldn't eliminate any of the granular materials with that one. And can be applied to nearby turf without injury. So here you would eliminate Barrier G, Biathlon, excuse me, Broadstar, the Harrell 75G, the Pennant, and Route, and Treflan. Those materials can cause injury to cool season turf grasses. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about some of the new weed problems that we're seeing are being brought to landscapes from nurseries unintentionally, of course, either container or field nurseries. Bittercress, a newer weed called mulberry weed. Both of these weeds have the ability to explosively shoot their seeds into new areas, and this seems to be the way that they're moving around. Mugwort, as we already covered, and Kailinga also is a weed that we've seen moving in on compost into landscapes, and then from landscapes into turf. So the key to the efficient management of weeds in the fall is knowing what the problems, or at least knowing roughly what problems you have to deal with and what tools you might have available to manage them. And then once the possible options are identified, then you still have quite a list of options if you're using herbicides. And that's where economic choices would kick in to guide your choice on what materials to use. That would be the economically best choice for that particular site. And I think at that point, so this is my contact information. If we don't answer your questions, or if you want to discuss something more fully with me, you can either call me or send me an email, and I'd be happy to answer as well as I can. So
okay.
I think
Great. Thank you, Andy, for a great presentation. We have time for some questions and answers. So if you have questions in the audience, feel free to type them into your box on your console. And we actually have some free submitted questions from when folks registered. So we can go through some of those now. So Andy, you may have touched on this a little bit, but we have a couple questions about nutsedge. Is there any way to prevent nutsedge?
It depends on what state you are living in, to the answer to that question. Because in New York, there are several of the herbicides that are effective preventive nutsedge can't be used, particularly on Long Island. But in the rest of the country, metolachlor or pennant magnum is a very good material. And also freehand and tower have a certain level of activity at preventing this weed from getting established pre-emergently.
Okay, great. I have a question that is probably better for Jason. Jason, the question is, we currently use SureGuard as a late winter / early spring application. How long is the effectiveness when applied in the fall?
Well, what we find really with SureGuard overall is that the effectiveness is kind of dependent on the weather. I think Andy would probably agree to this, but generally what you see with SureGuard is that it's broken down by microbial activity. So the cooler the temperatures, the longer it lasts. So we find that under cool conditions, a lot of times we'll find applications last, over 8 months. Under really warm conditions, that residual control may just be 2 to 3 months under really warm conditions. So really, I think one of the things that they alluded to is that they made applications in the fall, and I think Andy's talked about that, but that's one of the benefits of making fall applications, especially with SureGuard broken down by microbial activity, that you can really get long control when you apply something in the fall.
That's true. I didn't touch on that particular aspect, but I would agree with that. And SureGuard in particular is one that a late fall application will get you the control in the fall and also the follow-up spring control too. So that should be considered in properties that that you're not going to be able to get to early in the spring in terms of weed control. That would be a consideration to have.
Okay, great. We have a question about organic applications, and I know you touched on that a little bit, Andy. Are organic applications equally or less effective than chemical applications for weed control?
There could be a long answer, but I'd say the short answer is they're generally less effective. We really don't have available to us yet. I think it's maybe a matter of time before those products are available, but I don't think we have, I know we don't really have products that would be considered equivalent to the conventional ones in terms of control.
And this is kind of along the same line, something you touched on in your presentation, but I just wanted you to elaborate on. You said that organic and non-chemical are not the same thing. Can you just explain what you mean by that a little bit more?
Right. Okay. So particularly it's important in New York because there's a law that doesn't allow any pesticide that has a caution or warning label on it. So that only allows for organic or exempt herbicides or pesticides to be used. So you can use a material like Adios, which is a sodium chloride, or some of the other other products that are organic and exempt. So those are chemicals, but that doesn't mean that you have to stop there. I mean, you can continue to do weed control without chemicals, which would be the other side of that coin, with hand removal and cultivation, etc.
Okay, great. Question from the audience about applications in beds. Do you recommend before or after mulching?
We've actually looked at this more in the spring and early summer than in the fall over the years. I would say for the most part it's a better choice to make the application after a freshly replenished bed has been made with mulch. Again, because you're using the mulch to control a lot of the weeds pre-emergently that are on the soil, and so the herbicide will actually control the weeds that are blowing in. If you put that herbicide under the mulch, you're lacking that second protection of weeds that move in after the fact.
Okay, that makes sense. A question about, it's in a nursery, weed they think is mare's tail or horseweed. What is your recommended control for that?
Really any of the in the fall, in the early fall, pre-emergently, any of the combination products, including and also Broadstar and Marengo in this case, are really effective or can be very effective, and it's not usually a problem with not having the right product to use. It's just a matter of getting it on before those weeds germinate, or if they've already germinated to control them, as well as put the residual material. Now, sometimes in some parts of the country, there's also a spring flush of this weed. So it's not just a winter, just the late summer germinating. It also can germinate in the springtime too.
I know, Andy, that's what we see a lot here in the Midwest is both fall and spring germinating mare's tail. And I think you're exactly right, though. It seems like timing really seems to be as much as product choice. I mean, certainly with Broadstar and SureGuard, an application like right now, before you see a lot of germination here in the fall, tends to really make a big difference.
Yes, and the other thing about SureGuard, the spray form of it is that it does give you also some post-emergent control, which the granular Broadstar would not.
Okay, great. Here's a question that you both might want to tackle as well. And again, you kind of touched on it in the presentation throughout, but what's the most common cause of breakthrough weeds?
I'd say breaking the physical barrier that's created when you make that application and activate it with the irrigation or rain. That creates basically a chemical layer, and so any kind of walking on that or anything that will disrupt that is going to create a spot for weeds to move in and germinate. Also, certainly perennial weeds will come up through mulch and many times the herbicide as well. So those really are not. They're not even supposed to be controlled by a lot of the materials, so it's just something to be aware of that will happen with that will be a breakthrough.
Yeah, I was going to say, Marisa, there really does seem to be the two things, just what Andy mentioned. It's the application itself, but then also weed identification. A lot of times, especially in landscapes, when I go out and look at the situation somebody may have, it actually is a perennial weed that maybe the herbicide of choice wasn't the right one or was still going to grow through that. So those two things really, I mean, making a nice uniform application at the proper rate and then following up and make sure that you have the right weed that you're really targeting.
Okay, great. We have a couple specific situation questions. So, Andy, here's one. What can I do about weed control in juniper rugs?
That's in terms of pre-emergent weed control. There's really the host of most of the materials I've talked about would be allowed to be able to use on an established juniper ground cover. Oftentimes, what we see coming through juniper beds are weeds like quackgrass, nutsedge, even Canada thistle, and there are some materials that can be used particularly at certain times of year, right over the top, and particularly the grasses and the nutsedge those applications can be made over the top of the bed.
Okay, we have a question about. I think the question, this was a typed-in one. I think they're asking about preen, the commercial version of preen. How was that in a landscape bed?
Oh yeah, I meant to put that in as another trade name for treflan, which it is. It's 1.5% granule of treflan. Now there are other products called Preen South, which have treflan and isoxaben in them. So it's not always the same active ingredient with the name Preen, but essentially if it has the treflan in it, it's a fairly mild in terms of injury to any nearby plants herbicide. So it could be used around many herbaceous annuals and perennials as well.
Okay, great. We have a question about what would you recommend for over 50 acres of pavers surrounded by turf and ornamentals? I assume they're asking about, weed control among the pavers.
Okay, so the thing that would drive that decision would be materials that aren't going to stain the pavers, I think is one consideration anyway. And that really eliminates a lot of materials because of the orange and yellow color that many of these pre-emergent materials have. But SureGuard and Broadstar and Ronstar are three that come to mind that would not be staining, and that could give you residual control within the crevices between the pavers.
Okay, great. We have someone asking, where can I buy? I don't know if they mean SureGuard specifically or any or all of the products that you mentioned, Andy. I assume the answer is a commercial turf distributor, but if you two would like to address that as well, that would be great.
Jason?
Yeah, I was going to say probably your commercial turfgrass distributor would be able to help out most of these folks. Many of the active ingredients, though, that Andy talked about in his presentation are also at some of the bigger box star chains as well. So there's opportunity, I think, depending on the size. If you're a little bit larger, I certainly would look for a distributor in our area, or even try a box star.
Okay, great. Lots of very specific questions. So we have just a few more minutes, so we might as well keep going. Andy, how do you recommend controlling buckthorn seedlings?
I'm not familiar with that term. Boxthorn?
Buckthorn is the question.
Oh, buckthorn.
Buckthorn, yeah, I bet.
Oh, buckthorn, yeah. I'm not sure pre-emergently what will control that. And maybe, Jason, whether SureGuard or Broadstar would work on that?
They will work on it, from true seedlings. I've seen that, Andy.
Okay. And, of course, the Roundup or glyphosate should work post-emergently non-selective.
Okay, great. And one more very specific. How do I get rid of white clover in a shrub bed of, and I'm probably going to butcher the name of this, Fragaria caelinosis? Does that sound like?
Probably, yeah, I think that's either wild strawberry or Siberian barren strawberry, maybe.
Okay.
That's a tough one. Although I think maybe, I'm pretty sure it wouldn't be labeled, but it's something for researchers maybe to look at. In that clopyralid is labeled for use in commercial strawberries. So if this is related to a commercial strawberry, that would actually tolerate clopyralid or Lantrell, and a very low rate of that will control clover. But again, I'm almost positive that's not labeled, but it's certainly something that we can start looking at to maybe see if we can get something like that added to the label.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think some spot sprays of clopyralid might ultimately be pretty effective.
And then we have a follow-up to that paver question. If they are surrounded by turf and ornamentals, would SureGuard burn or harm the turf and ornamentals?
Well, I'll let Jason answer, but my impression would be if there's going to be runoff, then whatever it's running off into, anything herbaceous, including grasses, would be injured to a certain extent.
And I always tell people when they're treating pavers with SureGuard or Broadstar, to be cautious. We actually do have a warm season turf label now for SureGuard. I mean, grasses in general do have some tolerance once they're established. What I've really found is that the key with SureGuard, and you make an application the pavers like that is that the first watering, hopefully either rainfall or irrigation, you have a moderate level, less than an inch for sure. You really just want something to work the herbicide into where it can even get between the cracks and crevices and bind, and then the material will stay put. Actually, that crack and crevices of pavers along turf has been really one of the main uses for SureGuard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, its activity and also its lack of staining are two of the real pluses.
And like you said throughout, it does have activity on grasses and broadleaf, so I mean it is a product that performs quite well there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Well, we are right at 1 hour, so we will go ahead and wrap up. I just want to thank you both again, Andy for a great presentation, and Jason for being on hand for some Q&A, and for SureGuard sponsoring the webinar. So we'll let Allison do a wrap-up here.
Thank you for attending the Landscape Bedweeds webinar. A recording of this webinar will be posted on the landscapemanagement.net website and will be emailed to you 1 day from today. Please visit the Landscape Management website for information about future events like this one. Thank you for attending, and have a nice afternoon.